There are action movies where the villain wants something. There are movies where the villain has a face, a voice, a plan, and a reason to hate the heroes. And then there is Unstoppable, a film whose central antagonist is a machine that wants absolutely nothing. It does not hate anyone. It does not know anyone is chasing it. It cannot be intimidated, persuaded, distracted, or reasoned with. It simply keeps moving. A massive freight train tears through the Pennsylvania countryside with no engineer controlling it, carrying a load of hazardous cargo that could turn a railroad accident into a catastrophe affecting thousands of lives. Every second it travels makes the eventual consequences worse. Every mile removes another possible solution. And every attempt to stop it creates another opportunity for something to go horribly wrong. That is the strange brilliance of Unstoppable. On paper, the movie sounds almost absurdly simple. A runaway train is heading toward a populated area. 2 railroad workers have to stop it. That is basically the entire premise. There is no complicated conspiracy to uncover, no supernatural mythology, no elaborate villain to understand, and no mystery about what the heroes need to accomplish. Yet somehow, for 98 minutes, the simplicity becomes terrifying. Because the train represents a problem that has already escaped human control. And once something reaches that point, knowledge, authority, technology, money, and institutional power all begin to feel strangely fragile. The people watching from control rooms can see the train. They can track its location. They can calculate its speed. They can communicate with people along the route. They can study maps, activate switches, dispatch emergency crews, and debate possible solutions. But none of that changes the most important fact. The train is still moving. That single idea gives Unstoppable its unusual tension. The movie is not really asking whether the characters can solve a puzzle. It is asking whether human beings can regain control after a mistake has become too large for the system designed to contain it. And that is where Frank Barnes and Will Coulson enter the story. Frank is experienced, disciplined, and almost stubbornly professional. He has spent years working around trains powerful enough to make a human being look insignificant. He understands the machinery, the tracks, the procedures, and the consequences of getting something wrong. Will is younger. He is less experienced, less confident, and emotionally distracted by problems outside the railroad. He is carrying the kind of personal baggage that makes even an ordinary workday feel heavier than it should. At first, these 2 men do not seem like natural partners. Frank sees experience as something earned through years of doing the job correctly. Will is still trying to prove that he belongs in the profession. Frank is controlled where Will is impulsive. Frank thinks before acting. Will sometimes acts because he is desperate to prove that he can. But the runaway train does not care about any of those differences. It does not care who is older. It does not care who is more experienced. It does not care who has made mistakes. It does not care which department should have prevented the disaster. It only keeps moving. And that turns the entire movie into something more interesting than a conventional disaster thriller. Because the train becomes a physical representation of consequences. A mistake happens, then another person inherits the problem, then another, until eventually someone has to stand directly in front of the consequences and accept responsibility for stopping them. That idea becomes especially powerful because Unstoppable was inspired by the real CSX 8888 runaway train incident. The movie dramatizes that event and reshapes it into a tightly constructed action thriller, but the real-world foundation gives the premise an uncomfortable authenticity. This could happen. That is the feeling the film wants. Not necessarily that this exact sequence will happen, but that enormous machines operate every day because human beings trust systems, procedures, and other human beings to control them. And whenever that chain breaks, something as ordinary as a train can suddenly become terrifying. Tony Scott understood exactly how to photograph that terror. He does not treat the train like a digital object floating inside a computer-generated environment. He photographs steel, wheels, tracks, switches, sparks, smoke, windows, control panels, warning lights, and human faces. The movie is filled with physical surfaces. Everything seems heavy. Everything seems capable of crushing something. Scott's camera is constantly moving, cutting, searching, compressing, and expanding the space around the characters. The result is an action movie that feels less like watching an event and more like being trapped inside it. The train is always somewhere. Sometimes we see it. Sometimes we hear it. Sometimes we only see the people reacting to what it is doing. And sometimes that is even more frightening. Because the most effective monster in a thriller does not need to appear every second. It only needs to remain inevitable. Unstoppable builds its entire identity around that inevitability. The audience already knows the basic destination. We know the train must eventually be stopped. We know Frank and Will are not going to spend the entire movie chasing an empty locomotive without reaching some kind of resolution. So why does the suspense work? Because the real question is not whether the train will stop. It is how. And what will it cost? That distinction is the key to understanding why such a straightforward movie remains so effective. Unstoppable does not depend on surprise. It depends on escalation. Every solution creates another problem. Every attempt buys time but also demonstrates how difficult the situation really is. The train becomes faster, the geography becomes more dangerous, the population around the tracks becomes denser, and the available options become narrower. The movie keeps reducing the characters' choices. And the fewer choices they have, the more important every choice becomes. That is also why Frank and Will matter so much. Without them, Unstoppable would simply be a disaster movie about an object moving from one location to another. With them, it becomes a story about responsibility. Frank represents experience. Will represents potential. Frank knows what can go wrong because he has spent years seeing how small mistakes become serious problems. Will has not accumulated that knowledge yet, but he possesses something Frank cannot manufacture for him: the willingness to act when fear and uncertainty become overwhelming. Their relationship becomes the human heart inside a mechanical thriller. And the most interesting thing about Unstoppable may not be how the train is stopped. It may be why these two particular men have to be the ones who stop it. The answer begins long before the first major emergency. It begins with the movie's fascination with ordinary work. Before the train becomes a monster, railroading is simply a job. People arrive for their shifts. They inspect equipment. They communicate with supervisors. They move freight. They follow schedules. They complain about coworkers. They think about their families. They make mistakes. They try to get through another day. That ordinary atmosphere is important because the movie does not introduce disaster into a fantasy world. It introduces disaster into someone's workplace. And that makes the premise immediately recognizable. Most people will never operate a locomotive weighing hundreds of tons. Most people will never stand beside a freight train carrying hazardous materials. But almost everyone understands the feeling of being responsible for something that could go wrong. A deadline. A machine. A customer. A family. A decision. A mistake. The scale changes, but the psychology does not. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing a problem is no longer waiting for you to solve it. It is already moving. That is the fear Unstoppable understands. And it is also why the film's apparently simple premise contains more emotional material than its marketing might suggest. When the movie was released in 2010, Hollywood was increasingly comfortable with enormous digital spectacle. Action cinema was becoming faster, louder, and more dependent on computer-generated environments and increasingly elaborate set pieces. Unstoppable arrived with a different kind of promise. A train. Real tracks. Real-looking industrial environments. A recognizable physical threat. A ticking clock. 2 working men. That simplicity was almost old-fashioned. Tony Scott was hardly an old-fashioned filmmaker, however. His career had been built around kinetic visual language. He understood speed better than most directors of his generation, and he had already made movies in which machines, weapons, aircraft, vehicles, and human bodies became components of a larger visual rhythm. But Unstoppable takes that vocabulary and applies it to something remarkably ordinary. A freight train. That choice is crucial. Because airplanes can feel glamorous. Sports cars can feel glamorous. Military technology can feel glamorous. A freight locomotive carrying industrial cargo usually does not. It is a working machine. It exists to move things. It is part of the infrastructure people rarely think about until something goes wrong. Tony Scott turns that background object into the star of the movie. The result is almost ironic. The film spends so much time showing machinery that the machinery becomes emotional. A wheel turning too quickly begins to feel like a heartbeat. A brake mechanism becomes a source of suspense. A switch becomes a decision. A red signal becomes a warning. A stretch of empty track becomes a threat. A curve in the railroad becomes a question. The physical world starts communicating the story before the characters even speak. That is one reason the movie remains unusually tactile. You can almost feel the weight of the train. You can hear the metal. You can imagine the vibration passing through the floor. You can see how small a human body looks beside the locomotive. And that contrast between human scale and industrial scale is one of the film's most important visual ideas. Frank and Will are powerful only because they understand something about the machine. They are not stronger than it. They are not faster than it. They cannot simply overpower it. Their advantage is knowledge. They know how the system works. And eventually, they have to use that knowledge creatively because the system itself has begun to fail. That is the fundamental tension at the center of Unstoppable. Human beings built these machines. Human beings designed the railroad. Human beings created the procedures that are supposed to keep everything safe. And yet, when the machine escapes those procedures, human beings suddenly look incredibly small. That contradiction gives the movie a surprising philosophical dimension. Civilization creates systems to control enormous forces. Then civilization becomes dependent on those systems functioning correctly. When they fail, the same sophistication that made the system powerful can make the consequences enormous. The runaway train is therefore not simply a physical threat. It is the consequence of interconnected human decisions. Someone makes a mistake. Someone else assumes the problem can be corrected. Another person trusts the information they have received. A procedure fails. A solution arrives too late. And eventually, Franken will inherit a disaster they did not create. That is why their heroism feels different from the heroism of a traditional action protagonist. They are not saving the world because they were chosen. They are not fighting because destiny demanded it. They are doing their jobs under circumstances that have become almost impossible. And that distinction matters. Unstoppable is deeply interested in the idea that ordinary work can become extraordinary when the stakes suddenly change. Frank is not introduced as a superhero. He is introduced as a railroad professional. Will is not introduced as a legendary warrior. He is a younger worker trying to navigate a complicated personal and professional life. Their greatest heroic quality is not physical strength. It is competence. That is a much quieter form of heroism. And perhaps because it is quieter, it feels more believable. The movie also understands something about masculinity that many action films miss. Frank's masculinity is not based on dominating everyone around him. His authority comes from responsibility. He knows what he is doing. He understands that other people depend on him. He does not need to announce his importance constantly because his experience speaks through his decisions. Will initially has a different relationship with masculinity. He wants to prove himself. He is frustrated by being treated as inexperienced. His personal life has also left him emotionally unstable, making the need to prove his competence even stronger. The railroad therefore becomes more than a workplace for him. It becomes a place where he can either continue behaving like someone trying to prove himself or become someone capable of accepting responsibility. Frank's challenge is almost the opposite. He has spent so long relying on his own experience that trusting someone younger does not come naturally. So both men have something to learn. Will has to learn that courage without judgment can become recklessness. Frank has to learn that experience without trust can become isolation. The runaway train forces both lessons upon them. That is why their relationship gradually becomes more compelling as the external danger increases. At first, their conflict is personal. Eventually, it becomes functional. They have to communicate. They have to listen. They have to trust each other's strengths. The train strips away the distractions. There is no time for ego when hundreds of lives may depend on a decision made in seconds. And that is where the movie's title becomes more interesting. Unstoppable initially sounds like a description of the train. But by the end, it begins to sound like a question. What does unstoppable really mean? Does it mean physically impossible to stop? Does it mean nobody has yet found the right solution? Or does it mean that people have become convinced something cannot be changed, and that belief itself becomes part of the problem? Tony Scott never turns the movie into a philosophical lecture about these ideas. He does something much smarter. He makes the audience feel them. The train moves. The clock advances. The map changes. The distance closes. And every time the movie seems to offer relief, the threat finds a way to become larger. That rhythm is the foundation of the entire experience. Before Unstoppable becomes a story about Frank and Will, it becomes a story about time. Time is the invisible antagonist. The train does not merely move through space. It consumes possibilities. Every minute that passes means fewer options remain. Every mile brings the train closer to people who have no idea what is coming. And because the audience understands this, even quiet scenes carry tension. A control room conversation can feel like an action sequence because we know that while people are talking, the train is still moving. That is one of Tony Scott's great strengths. He understands that suspense does not require constant physical action. It requires the audience to understand the consequences of delay. The longer someone hesitates, the more terrifying the next decision becomes. That is also why the Railroad Control Center is so important. It represents institutional intelligence. There are people watching, people calculating, people communicating, people trying to find answers. The system is not completely incompetent. That would actually make the story less interesting. The system contains capable people. But capability is not the same as control. And that distinction becomes increasingly important as the emergency develops. Connie Hooper, operating from the control center, becomes one of the film's most important human links between information and action. She cannot physically grab the train. She cannot climb onto it. She cannot apply the brakes herself. What she can do is communicate. And communication becomes another form of survival. The movie repeatedly cuts between people separated by distance but connected through radios, phones, screens, and railroad infrastructure. The visual structure mirrors the larger theme. No single person can solve the crisis alone. The railroad is a network. The disaster is a failure of that network. And the solution ultimately requires the network to function through individual human beings who are willing to act. That is why the film's supporting characters matter. Dewey, Gillies, Judd, Connie, the railroad management, emergency crews, family members. And the people watching the crisis from different locations all create a miniature society around the runaway train. Some are calm. Some are careless. Some are frightened. Some are overly confident. Some are willing to take risks. Some are trying to avoid responsibility. And some simply do not have enough information to understand how serious the situation has become. That variety keeps the movie from becoming a two-person exercise in isolation. The train is moving through a populated world. Every crossing, bridge, switch, and community adds another human consequence. The physical geography becomes a moral geography. The farther the train travels, the more people become vulnerable. And eventually the question changes. At the beginning, the problem is operational. Then it becomes financial. Then mechanical. Then logistical. Finally, it becomes human. The difference is enormous. A damaged train is a corporate problem. A damaged town is a community disaster. Injured people are something else entirely. That escalation is what gives the movie its emotional architecture. The train becomes increasingly dangerous not simply because it is faster, but because the consequences surrounding it become larger. And this is where the real-life inspiration quietly strengthens the movie. The CSX 8888 incident demonstrated that a runaway locomotive could become a terrifyingly real emergency. The film takes that foundation and builds a dramatic structure around it, but the basic fear remains grounded in reality. A powerful machine can continue moving even after the person who was supposed to control it is no longer in control. That is a frightening idea precisely because it requires no science fiction. No monster. No explosion. No impossible technology. Just momentum. And momentum is one of the film's deepest metaphors. Momentum is what happens when movement becomes harder to interrupt than it was to begin. A small mistake can create a larger problem. A larger problem can create another. Eventually, people may find themselves spending enormous amounts of energy simply trying to undo what could have been prevented earlier. That idea extends beyond railroads. It applies to workplaces, relationships, families, institutions, technology, even personal mistakes. There are moments when people realize they have allowed something to continue for too long. At that point, stopping it becomes much harder than starting it was. Unstoppable turns that psychological experience into a physical object. You can see the consequence coming. You can measure its speed. You can calculate its distance. And you still may not be able to stop it. That is terrifying. But it is also strangely hopeful. Because if the train were truly beyond all possibility of control, there would be no story. The movie exists because human beings can adapt. They can improvise. They can cooperate. They can take responsibility. They can use knowledge differently when the normal procedures fail. That is ultimately what Frank and will represent. Not the elimination of chaos. The human ability to respond to chaos. And that is a much more meaningful definition of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Frank is afraid. Will is afraid. The people in the control center are afraid. The people along the tracks are afraid. Courage exists because fear exists. The difference is that some people allow fear to determine their actions, while others act despite it. Unstoppable builds its entire emotional payoff around that distinction. And the deeper the train travels into the story, the more obvious it becomes that stopping it will require something beyond technical expertise. It will require trust. It will require sacrifice. And above all, it will require two men who began the day barely able to understand each other to recognize that their individual weaknesses can become strengths when combined. Frank knows the railroad. Will can move where Frank cannot. Frank understands consequences. Will understands desperation. Frank brings experience. Will brings adaptability. Neither is enough by himself. Together, they become the film's answer to the runaway machine. The train has momentum. The men have choice. That is the real conflict. And once you understand that, Unstoppable stops looking like a simple movie about a train and starts looking like something much more universal. A story about what happens when responsibility arrives after control has already been lost. The movie's production history makes that simplicity even more interesting. Unstoppable did not arrive on screen effortlessly. The project had been developing for years, moving through different stages, creative attachments, title changes, budget concerns, and studio uncertainty before Tony Scott ultimately became the director who shaped it into the film audiences know. Mark Baumbach's screenplay provided the basic framework, and the project had existed under the earlier title Runaway Train during development. Like many Hollywood projects, it passed through different possible versions before finding its final identity. Robert Schwenke was attached during an earlier stage. Martin Campbell was also involved. The director's chair changed. The project evolved. And throughout that process, the biggest challenge remained remarkably simple. How do you spend a major studio budget on a movie whose entire premise can be explained in one sentence? That is not a trivial question. A complicated story can justify complicated production. Unstoppable could not hide behind complexity. The train had to be convincing. The environment had to feel real. The audience had to understand where everyone was. The danger had to feel physical. And the characters had to remain emotionally interesting even though the basic objective never changed. That is a difficult balance. Denzel Washington's involvement gave the project immediate star power. His presence meant audiences could believe the central character possessed authority without requiring the movie to spend 20 minutes establishing it. Chris Pine brought a different energy. By 2010, Pine had already become widely recognized through Star Trek, giving him an emerging blockbuster profile. But Will Coulson is not written as another effortless action hero. He is younger, emotionally complicated, and visibly less comfortable in his own role. That contrast was useful. The movie needed Frank to feel experienced without making Will irrelevant. It needed Will to make mistakes without making him incompetent. And it needed both men to contribute meaningfully to the solution. That balance is harder than it looks. The studio also faced concerns about cost. A movie involving locomotives, railroad infrastructure, extensive action sequences, stunts, practical locations, visual effects, aerial photography, and major stars was never going to be cheap. The reported production budget ultimately landed around the $95 to $100 million range. That makes the film's disciplined premise even more impressive. For that amount of money, Hollywood could have built a much more elaborate story. Instead, Unstoppable spends its resources making one physical problem feel convincing. That was Tony Scott's advantage. He knew that spectacle does not necessarily come from complexity. Sometimes spectacle comes from scale. Show a freight train moving through an industrial landscape. Then place a human being beside it. The contrast does the work. The machinery is enormous. The person is fragile. The audience understands the danger immediately. The production also benefited from cinematographer Ben Saracen, whose photography captures the railroad world with an industrial texture that fits Scott's style. The film does not make the landscape beautiful in a conventional postcard sense. It makes it functional, dirty, enormous, and dangerous. That matters because the environment is not merely background. The environment is part of the threat. Tracks dictate direction. Bridges create choke points. Curves hide what is coming. Switches determine where the train can go. Open spaces make the train visible but offer little protection. Urban areas increase the potential human cost. The geography becomes part of the screenplay. That is one of the reasons the movie remains relatively easy to follow despite Tony Scott's aggressive editing style. The film moves quickly, but it always has a spatial objective. The audience needs to know where the runaway train is. Where Frank and Will are. Where the tracks lead. How much distance remains. And what happens if they fail? Without that clarity, the speed would become meaningless. The audience would see motion without understanding danger. Tony Scott avoids that trap more often than not. His editing is fast, but the objective is clear. That is a crucial distinction. Fast editing is not automatically exciting. Fast editing becomes exciting when every cut gives the audience another piece of information. A wheel. A signal. A face. A map. A switch. A radio transmission. A control panel. A helicopter. A stretch of track. A town. A clock. Each fragment adds information. Together, they create urgency. The movie's marketing understood this immediately. The promotional campaign emphasized scale, speed, and the number of lives at risk. The famous tagline, 1 million tons. 100,000 lives. 100 minutes, reduces the entire movie to 3 pieces of information. Mass. Human consequence. Time. That is almost the perfect advertisement for the film because those are the 3 things the story keeps manipulating. The train is massive. The potential consequences involve ordinary people. And time is running out. The simplicity that might have sounded like a weakness becomes the marketing advantage. You do not need to explain the premise. You only need to make people imagine what would happen if the premise were real. That was especially useful in 2010. When action audiences were increasingly familiar with massive franchise worlds and complicated mythology. Unstoppable offered something different. No universe to understand. No previous film required. No comic book history. No sequel setup. Just a train. And 2 men trying to stop it. That kind of clarity can be refreshing. It also explains why the film works so well as a standalone thriller. You can discover it years after its release without needing to know anything else. There is no homework. The story begins. The train moves. The clock starts. And the audience is immediately invited to worry. That invitation works because the fear underneath the movie is universal. Everyone understands losing control. A person may never have stood beside a freight locomotive. But everyone has watched a small mistake become a larger problem. Everyone knows what it feels like when an argument goes too far. When a deadline approaches. When an accident happens. When responsibility arrives unexpectedly. When something cannot simply be undone. The train becomes a physical metaphor for that feeling. It carries the past forward. It cannot reverse itself emotionally. It cannot apologize. It cannot stop because someone suddenly regrets what happened. It has momentum. Human beings have to deal with the consequences. That is why the relationship between Frank and Will matters so much. They are not simply two protagonists assigned to the same action sequence. They represent two different ways of dealing with responsibility. Frank's instinct is control. Will's instinct is reaction. Frank trusts knowledge. Will trusts movement. Frank has learned caution through experience. Will has learned confidence through necessity. At the beginning, those differences create friction. But the crisis gradually reveals that neither philosophy is sufficient by itself. Experience without adaptability becomes rigid. Adaptability without experience becomes reckless. The solution requires both. And that is where the movie's generational dimension becomes interesting. Frank represents accumulated knowledge. Will represents the generation that has not yet accumulated it. For Will to become competent, he does not simply need more confidence. He needs someone who can teach him what experience looks like when the stakes are real. Frank, meanwhile, needs to recognize that the future cannot simply be judged according to the standards of the past. The younger worker may not know everything. But that does not mean he knows nothing. The relationship therefore becomes a subtle exchange. Frank gives Will knowledge. Will forces Frank to trust again. The railroad becomes a workplace where that transfer of knowledge happens under the worst possible conditions. And that idea gives the movie a warmth that its cold industrial setting might initially conceal. Because beneath the steel, the film is about people. People who work. People who make mistakes. People who worry about their families. People who want to prove themselves. People who sometimes fail. People who still have to show up the next day. That working class dimension is easy to overlook because the movie is marketed as an action thriller. But it is essential to the emotional texture. Frank is not a billionaire. Will is not a government agent. They are workers. Their tools happen to be enormous. Their workplace happens to contain enough steel and fuel to create a catastrophe. Their heroism comes from doing the job when doing the job becomes dangerous. That is one of the reasons the movie's emotional payoff feels satisfying even though its structure is predictable. The audience is not watching to discover whether Frank and Will eventually succeed. The audience is watching to see whether they will become the people capable of succeeding. That is a different kind of suspense. The train's destination is external. The transformation of the men is internal. And the two tracks eventually converge. As the crisis escalates, Frank's confidence becomes less about proving that he is right and more about understanding what needs to be done. Will's courage becomes less about proving that he is fearless and more about accepting that fear is unavoidable. The movie gradually strips away their individual defenses. Frank cannot remain the isolated veteran. Will cannot remain the insecure newcomer. They have to become a team. That transformation is not announced. It happens through behavior. A look. A decision. A moment of trust. A willingness to follow another person's judgment. This is where Denzel Washington's performance becomes particularly important. Frank does not need to explain every emotion. Washington can communicate skepticism, irritation, fear, determination. and reluctant respect through small changes in expression. That restraint prevents Frank from becoming a stereotypical action hero. He feels like a man who has spent years learning how to keep his emotions under control because the job demands it. And when that control finally becomes strained, the audience feels the pressure. Chris Pine works from the opposite direction. Will's emotions are closer to the surface. He is younger, more defensive, more eager to prove himself. His uncertainty gives the movie a different emotional texture. Together, the performances create a useful contrast. Washington's stillness gives Pine's nervous energy something to push against. Pine's volatility prevents Washington's character from becoming emotionally flat. Their chemistry is therefore not based on instant friendship. It is based on friction. And friction creates heat. That is true of the train as well. Metal against metal. Wheel against rail. Brake against momentum. The movie constantly finds physical equivalents for emotional conflict. This is why the railroad imagery is so much more than decoration. The tracks are predetermined paths. Once the train is moving, its choices are limited. But the switches introduce another idea. A switch can redirect movement. It does not stop the train. It changes where the train is going. That makes the railroad an unusually effective visual metaphor for choice. People cannot always stop consequences. Sometimes they can only redirect them. Signals operate similarly. A red light is a warning. A green light appears to promise permission. But the audience knows that the system of signals is only useful if the machine responds to it. A signal cannot physically stop a runaway train. It can only communicate. That distinction reflects the larger institutional problem. Information is not control. Knowledge is not control. Authority is not control. Control exists only when someone can turn information into effective action. The movie repeatedly explores that gap. The people watching the train understand what is happening. The people on the ground understand what is happening. The people in the control center understand what is happening. But understanding does not automatically create a solution. The train keeps moving. And that is where the film becomes a meditation on institutional failure. Not because every institution in the story is incompetent, but because institutions are made of people. And people can make mistakes. They can become complacent. They can misunderstand information. They can assume someone else will solve the problem. They can prioritize procedure over reality. They can hesitate because the consequences of making the wrong decision are enormous. The runaway train exposes those weaknesses. It creates a situation where ordinary procedures are no longer enough. The movie's supporting characters therefore function as different responses to crisis. Dewey represents carelessness. Connie represents disciplined leadership. Judd represents professional courage. Management represents institutional decision-making. Frank represents experience. Will represents adaptation. Together, they form a small society confronting a single moving catastrophe. That is why the film's ensemble never feels completely disconnected from the central story. Even characters who never climb aboard the train contribute to the tension because they represent different ways of responding to responsibility. Some people want to contain the problem. Some want to avoid it. Some want to calculate it. Some want to confront it. And some simply want someone else to take responsibility. The movie's moral question is hidden inside that structure. Who is responsible when nobody intended to cause the disaster? If a mistake creates a chain reaction, where does responsibility end? Does it belong to the person who made the initial error? The institution that failed to prevent it? The people who failed to recognize the danger quickly enough? Or the people who finally decide they have to stop it? Unstoppable never gives a simple philosophical answer. Instead, it dramatizes the problem. The train becomes the physical consequence of a human mistake. And Franken will become the people who accept the responsibility of dealing with that consequence. That is why their heroism is so satisfying. They do not create the problem. They inherit it. And that makes their decision to confront it more meaningful. The same principle explains why Judd matters. His involvement reminds the audience that the railroad workers are not interchangeable pieces. They are human beings with relationships, histories, and limits. The crisis creates real costs. There is no magical reset button. The movie wants the audience to understand that professional courage can involve sacrifice. Not every attempt will succeed. Not every person who helps will walk away untouched. That gives the action a moral weight that pure spectacle would not have. The train is enormous. But the people confronting it are not invincible. That vulnerability is what keeps the suspense alive. And as the story moves deeper into its central pursuit, the geography becomes increasingly important. The railroad is no longer simply a place where trains operate. It becomes a narrowing corridor. Every bridge matters. Every curve matters. Every populated area matters. Every switch represents another possibility. The audience begins to understand the route almost like a countdown. The train is approaching something. Frank and Will are approaching something. The control center is racing against something. Everyone is moving toward the same point in time. That creates a form of suspense that does not require mystery. The audience knows what is coming. The tension comes from waiting for it. This is one of the oldest principles of suspense filmmaking. Sometimes showing the danger is more effective than hiding it. Unstoppable understands that completely. The train is often visible. We see its size. We see its speed. We see the tracks beneath it. We see the people who could be affected. The movie does not need to hide the monster. It needs to convince us that the monster cannot be stopped. And that is why the word unstoppable becomes progressively more threatening. At first it sounds like marketing. Then it becomes a problem. Eventually it becomes a challenge. Can human beings prove the word wrong? That question carries the movie forward. And the answer cannot come from technology alone. Technology is part of the problem. The same industrial sophistication that allows a freight train to carry enormous amounts of cargo across the country also creates the possibility of enormous consequences when control is lost. The movie does not reject technology. It simply refuses to pretend that technology replaces human judgment. Machines can move. Systems can calculate. Screens can display information. But someone still has to decide what to do. That is why Frank's knowledge matters. He understands the machine as a human environment. He knows that every mechanical action has a physical consequence. He knows what the train can tolerate. He knows what people can tolerate. And he understands that a solution that looks perfect on paper may become dangerous in practice. That practical intelligence is the opposite of abstraction. The control room sees numbers. Frank sees machinery. The difference matters. Will gradually learns to see the same way. His transformation is therefore not simply from cowardice to courage. It is from emotional reaction to professional judgment. He learns that being brave does not mean doing the most dangerous thing. Sometimes it means doing the necessary thing. That distinction becomes increasingly important as the situation worsens. The obvious solutions begin to disappear. The danger becomes more immediate. The possibility of catastrophic collision becomes harder to ignore. The railroad cannot simply wait for the train to run out of momentum. It cannot assume the problem will somehow resolve itself. The train is carrying too much force. The route is too populated. The consequences are too large. Eventually, someone has to physically intervene. And that is where unstoppable becomes almost mythological. A machine has escaped its boundaries. Two men decide to pursue it. The story begins to resemble a modern version of a classic confrontation between human beings and nature. Except the force here is something humans created. That makes the metaphor even stronger. The monster is our own invention. The danger is the product of our own infrastructure. And the solution must also come from human intelligence. This is why the film does not need a traditional villain. The train has become enough. Its neutrality is precisely what makes it frightening. A human villain can make a mistake. A human villain can change his mind. A human villain can become frightened. A machine cannot. The train does not understand the people on the tracks. It does not know that someone has children. It does not know that someone has a family problem. It does not know that someone is trying to prove himself. It does not know that another person has spent decades learning how to control machines like it. It simply moves. And that indifference gives the train a strange personality. Tony Scott creates that personality entirely through filmmaking. The framing makes it look aggressive. The sound makes it feel alive. The editing gives it rhythm. The close-ups give its components almost animalistic importance. The wheels turn. The steel shakes. The brakes strain. The horn erupts. Smoke trails behind it. The locomotive enters the frame like something that has no intention of stopping. The audience begins to respond to it as though it were a creature. But the movie never forgets that it is not alive. That distinction matters. The train has no evil. The people create the moral meaning around it. That makes the film's central question more uncomfortable. If the train is not evil, then where should the blame go? The easiest answer is the individual mistake. But the movie quietly suggests something larger. Systems can create conditions in which a single mistake becomes catastrophic. Institutions can become so dependent on procedure that they struggle when reality behaves differently. Workers can inherit problems created by decisions made far above them. And people at the bottom of a hierarchy can end up carrying responsibility for consequences they never caused. That class dimension is subtle but important. Frank and Will are not powerful executives. They are employees. They are the people closest to the machinery. When the system breaks, they are the ones physically exposed to the consequences. Their heroism therefore becomes a form of working-class dignity. They are not heroes because someone gives them a medal. They are heroes because they understand that the job has become bigger than the job description. At some point, professional responsibility becomes moral responsibility. That is the transformation the movie is really interested in. Doing your job correctly is not always glamorous. It is often invisible. Nobody applauds the person who prevents a disaster that never happens. Nobody makes a movie about the worker who checks everything twice and goes home. But when something goes wrong, competence suddenly becomes visible. Unstoppable builds its heroism around that idea. Frank's knowledge matters because the machine is dangerous. Will's willingness to act matters because knowledge without action is useless. Connie's communication matters because action without coordination can become chaos. Judd's courage matters because someone has to take risks. Everyone contributes differently. The movie therefore presents heroism as a network rather than a single personality. Even though Frank and Will are the emotional center, the final success depends on many people doing their part. That is another reason the film's ending works. The audience has watched the entire system struggle. The solution does not come from one magical trick. It comes from accumulated knowledge, timing, courage, cooperation, and sacrifice. Every earlier scene prepares the audience to understand why the final intervention is possible. The railroad itself becomes a giant machine of cause and effect. The opening mistake creates the runaway. The runaway creates the pursuit. The pursuit creates new risks. Those risks force new decisions. Those decisions eventually create the possibility of stopping the train. The movie's structure therefore mirrors its theme. Momentum exists in storytelling too. Once the crisis begins, every event pushes the next. There is very little wasted motion. That discipline is one of Unstoppable's greatest achievements. It does not need a complicated plot because the plot has been engineered around escalation. The challenge is not inventing more story. The challenge is making the same basic problem feel different every time it returns. At first, the train is a workplace malfunction. Then it is an emergency. Then it is a public threat. Then it is a potential catastrophe. Finally, it becomes a test of human courage. The object has not changed. The meaning has. That is sophisticated storytelling disguised as simplicity. And it is also why the movie can survive its own predictability. Of course the train is going to be stopped. The audience knows that. But knowing the destination does not eliminate the emotional journey. We know characters in tragedies are walking toward danger. We still care. We know a sports movie will probably end with a big game. We still care. We know the detective will probably identify the killer. We still care. The question is not always what happens. Sometimes the question is how the story makes us feel while it happens. Unstoppable's answer is physical anxiety. The film wants you to feel the train's momentum. It wants your body to react to the machinery. That is why the sound design is so important. The roar of the engine. The metallic clatter of wheels. The sudden violence of couplings. The hiss and strain of braking systems. The horn. The radio chatter. The helicopters. The sirens. The industrial ambience. All of these sounds create a world that feels alive. The train is frightening even when it is partially outside the frame because you can hear it. Sound gives the audience a sense of distance. A distant horn can be a warning. A sudden metallic impact can feel like an attack. A mechanical vibration can tell you that something is happening before the image confirms it. The movie uses sound as information. That is especially important because the action is so fast. Visuals can become fragmented. Sound keeps the world connected. It tells us that the machine is still moving. The score by Harry Gregson Williams works within that physical environment rather than completely overpowering it. Its rhythmic and electronic elements help create momentum without turning every moment into a giant orchestral announcement. The music often feels like another layer of machinery. Percussion becomes motion. Repetition becomes inevitability. Low-frequency textures become pressure. And when the film reduces the music, the absence itself becomes dramatic. Silence can be more frightening than noise because it creates anticipation. The audience knows something is about to happen. The machine seems to hold its breath. Then the metal erupts again. This relationship between music and sound is part of what makes the action sequences so immersive. The train does not simply look dangerous. It sounds dangerous. And because human beings respond strongly to sound, the effect can be almost physical. That physicality is central to Tony Scott's filmmaking. His action style has often been described through speed, rapid cuts, saturated imagery, aggressive framing, and multiple camera angles. But the real achievement is not speed by itself. It is the creation of kinetic perception. Scott wants the audience to feel that the camera itself is struggling to keep up. The image rarely sits still for long. The train moves. The camera moves. People move. Helicopters move. Information moves. Everything is in motion. That visual grammar could easily become exhausting. Sometimes it does. One of the legitimate criticisms of Unstoppable is that Tony Scott's editing can become excessive. Rapid cutting can obscure geography. Digital manipulation can reveal its period. Certain visual choices unmistakably belong to the early 2010s. But even those dated qualities are part of what makes the movie feel so intensely physical. Scott was not trying to create a timeless minimalist thriller. He was making a Tony Scott action film. And Unstoppable can be viewed as a late-career concentration of his filmmaking vocabulary. The fascination with speed. The obsession with machinery. The emphasis on professionals under pressure. The rapid intercutting between multiple locations. The use of music and sound to drive rhythm. The contrast between calm faces and violent environments. All of it had appeared throughout his career. Here, those ideas are stripped down to one central machine. That makes the film feel almost like a final statement about what Scott loved about action cinema. Movement. pressure, professionalism, technology, men facing impossible circumstances, and the fragile line between control and chaos. The fact that Unstoppable became Tony Scott's final directed feature gives that legacy an additional emotional weight. At the time of release, nobody could know it would be his final film. That is important. The movie was not designed as a farewell. It was simply the latest project from a director who had spent decades refining his approach to kinetic filmmaking. But knowing what came later inevitably changes how the film is remembered. There is something strangely appropriate about Scott's final feature being built around momentum. A machine that cannot stop. A story obsessed with forward motion. A director whose filmmaking style was itself defined by movement. The irony is difficult to ignore. But the movie's legacy should not depend entirely on that tragedy. It deserves to be remembered because it works. That is why its long-term reputation has remained stronger than its initial cultural footprint might suggest. Unstoppable was never a franchise. It did not become a cinematic universe. It did not generate endless sequels. It did not dominate popular culture in the way larger blockbuster properties did. Instead, it became something perhaps more durable. A movie people recommend. A movie people rediscover. A movie that appears on streaming platforms and suddenly produces the reaction, "Why is this so good?" Its simplicity helps. There is no barrier to entry. You do not need nostalgia for a particular fictional universe. You do not need to remember dozens of characters. You do not need to know what happened in the previous installment. The movie starts with a train. And that train is a problem. Everything else follows naturally. That makes it particularly well suited to rewatching. You can return to it for the action. Then notice the character dynamics. Then notice the sound. Then notice the geography. Then notice how often the film uses railroad imagery to communicate choice and consequence. Then notice how much of Frank's characterization is built through restraint rather than dialogue. The film rewards attention because its apparent simplicity hides structural precision. This is also why critics and audiences could respond positively while still identifying weaknesses. The movie's reception was broadly strong. Rotten Tomatoes listed an 87% critic score and a 73% audience score, while Metacritic placed it at 69 out of 100. CinemaScore audiences gave it an A-. Those numbers tell an interesting story. The film was not universally considered a masterpiece. It was not praised for revolutionary narrative complexity. Instead, its strongest qualities were exactly the things the movie was designed to deliver. Pacing, tension, craftsmanship, performances, direction. The train itself. Critics could see the formula. Audiences could feel the formula. And those are not contradictory reactions. A film can be predictable and effective at the same time. In fact, predictability can sometimes strengthen suspense if the filmmaking is good enough. Because once the audience knows what must eventually happen, attention shifts toward the details. How close are we? What can go wrong? Which character is going to take the risk? Will the plan work? What happens if it fails? How much damage will occur before the train stops? the destination becomes less important than the journey. That is the exact territory where Unstoppable thrives. Its critics are not wrong when they point out that the character arcs are relatively conventional. Frank is the experienced veteran. Will is the younger man with personal problems. The institutions can appear overly bureaucratic. The corporate figures can sometimes feel simplified. The outcome is never truly mysterious. The story occasionally relies on heightened action movie logic. Some secondary characters could have been explored more deeply. The family drama is functional rather than revolutionary. All of that is fair. But the important question is what the movie is trying to accomplish. Unstoppable is not attempting to become a sprawling examination of American labor institutions. It is not trying to reinvent the disaster genre. It is not trying to create a morally ambiguous psychological